How you doing, guys? This is Eric from WWIII.com. If you've watched my most recent video about my crystal ball predictions, you know I made the extremely difficult prediction that the war in Ukraine with NATO and whatever would expand. Oh my God. Not everyone was smart enough to come to that realization, but that's certainly happening. And most recently we've seen the Nord Stream pipelines be attacked or sabotaged. In my opinion, it's almost certainly done by US or NATO forces. Russia has the ability to cut off the pipeline, and they don't benefit at all from damaging it. You know, if they don't want Europe to get the gas, they just don't send it. They don't have to physically damage the pipeline, which has really no benefit to them. They, you know, if anyone's saying like, oh, they wanted an excuse to go to war, they have as much excuse as they needed. If they want an excuse to go to war, what they're doing with these referendums is going to be plenty. And for those of you who don't know, the major portions of Ukraine that were, you know, for historically had a lot of Russian people living there, at least ethnically Russian, you know, in the Donbass, and the I guess it's 10 to 20% of Ukraine at this point that's been taken over or reclaimed, or however you want to look at it, by Russia. They're holding votes about whether those areas want to join Russia and actually become part of Russia. Whether you think these votes are legitimate or coerced is totally irrelevant to the point I'm making, which is that it's going to happen. Almost certainly all four regions are going to vote to say that they want to rejoin Russia or to join Russia, which is going to be accepted by Russia. And then they'll have the kind of excuse, whether they want it or not, to say that any fighting that takes place in this area is an attack on what's now considered by them to be sovereign Russian soil. Whether or not you agree with that or anyone else particularly agrees with that doesn't really matter, because that's what's going to be the viewpoint of the Russians specifically. So that means that anything that's done there is going to be viewed as being done inside Russia. So they'll have an excuse according to their laws and everything that allow a much more harsh response than if it was just the special military operation ongoing in Ukraine. And then, like I've said for a while, I know there's interests in the US and NATO that want the war to expand for a whole list of reasons. I mean, we have just the general greed and of the military-industrial complex that more war is just what they want, for money, for power, for control, whatever. We have the idea of, you know, current administrations realizing that there's always a boost in support and approval for wartime presidents, wartime administrations. So I would not be surprised to see massive expansion of this activity leading up to the midterm elections and beyond. And then we have what I think is usually the main driver behind these conflicts is just a continued NATO expansion, and specifically the dollar hegemony, you know, the U.S. reserve currency, the petrodollar. If you look at all these, there's all these excuses about, you know, why all these countries get attacked by the U.S. and why others don't. But if you look at it, it's almost always related to the economics of the currency. You know, like Libya trying to go to a gold-backed currency. All these countries that have some sort of power, like with oil and stuff outside of the US dollar, they have money that they can not get part of the central banking system. And the big ones now are China, Russia, and even Iran, and a couple other countries that are moving away from this dollar system. And I think the specter of war gives them a very easy excuse to boost the economy artificially, to juice, you know, maybe to do that turnaround, which I've been saying for months, that we're going to see continued tightening, continued hawkish behavior until either there's a major crash or they have an excuse built in to reverse course. And they would rather have the excuse because they don't want the economy to collapse necessarily. They get their power by the money printing. That's how the Federal Reserve, that's how the central banks get their money, is by creating debt. So a deflationary cycle doesn't give them as much power as them being able to turn on the money printers. So, but they don't want to just do it out of nowhere, because first of all, that would either have to have them admit that the US economy is in shambles, and also it would make them the focus of any blame for what comes beyond that. But if they wait until the economy crashes first, or until the war were to break out, then they can say, you know, we're doing what we needed to, and now these external events happen, so we're just going to do what we need to do now, which is reverse course, lower interest rates, print more money, whatever they end up, use a central bank digital currency, whatever. They just don't want it to be their fault. They want there to be more of a public support for it. And I think that's what's going to happen. And I think that's one of the main reasons why they're going after Russia, is for all the reasons I mentioned, and then also if this allows them to actually defeat, which is what they hope, to defeat the powers that are trying to move away from the dollar, then that would be hugely beneficial for them. The problem is that we are not in NATO and the US are not in a good shape to be fighting Russia and specifically China. Like, would we win? Like, everyone says, like, oh, we can beat Russia. Like, sure, yeah, we'd probably win if it's just against Russia. We almost certainly would eventually win, but what does that look like? They've got nukes. What's the attrition rate going to be here? You know, we don't produce anything in this country anymore, including a lot of military like chemicals and components that we need. And now Germany is going to be basically completely shut off of gas for the winter. It's going to destroy them. Their productive capacity is going to plummet. Same with most of Europe. So, like, what does this war, a war with NATO and Russia, even look like, even without China getting involved? And if China gets involved, then it's just everything's going to go to shit. So this is not going to be good for us, even if we eventually, quote unquote, were to win. It's going to be ugly. And the normies are not ready for that. And what I'm worried about is that people are going to be willing to do any sort of bullshit and accept any sort of lie and infringement on freedom in the name of defeating evil Putin, who's causing all our problems. And someone had recently said, like, I hope the normies will wake up to this. I'm like, man, these people are out there still getting booster shots. You think they're going to wake up to what's going on in NATO and Ukraine when it's like their lives are in shambles and everyone's blaming, and everything in the mainstream news is blaming it on Putin and Russia and maybe even China? They'll be willing to do almost anything and give up any freedom, especially you and my freedoms, in exchange for their lives getting easier or defeating the bad man in Russia. So it's definitely going to get weird. Let me know what you guys think about all this, and I'll probably make a video exclusively on this in the future too. But there's this problem that I see with a lot of people where they'll see something that's happening, and even though it is really happening, they'll think that that's like the major kind of or the only thing that matters. That was a rambling explanation, but for example, like, people point to, okay, Russians are trying to leave because of a draft or a conscription, and that stuff. I'm not saying that stuff isn't happening. I know it is happening, but you can really skew the perspective on what something's like by focusing on things that are really happening, but blowing it out of proportion and not focusing on something else. So, like, depending on how you control the headlines and how you control the news, you can make all sorts of things seem true without actually even lying. Like, if someone had control over the news during the COVID situation here in the US, they could make it seem like a lot of people were against the vaccinations, because there are people. There are millions of people against the vaccinations and who are protesting it, and even in Canada and stuff. But that doesn't mean that the general overarching groups, they got like 90% of people vaccinated or something. It's still, they didn't stop it from happening. So just because there are certainly people trying to leave Russia, like, there's still 150, 160 million people in Russia. A few thousand or even a few 100,000 disagreeing doesn't change what's going to happen, and doesn't even necessarily mean that is the overall or even majority opinion. So don't just see evidence of something and think that that's the way things are everywhere just because that's what you agree with or that's what you think it should be. You try to absorb all that information everywhere and realize what's actually happening. And I think that's that's why people get in this mindset of, oh, Russia's failing or Russia's weak or everyone's trying to leave and no one supports this, because they find examples that support that and then just extrapolate that to the entire situation, where I don't necessarily think that's the case. Like I've already said, I disagree with the idea that Russia's collapsing. But at the same time, the people who are on the other end of the spectrum are saying that everything's going flawlessly for them. They're just steamrolling. They're having no issues. That's obviously not true. We know some of this stuff is extremely stressing their different systems militarily and everything, and that they were being spread pretty thin in terms of manpower, but they'd gone into this event with like a 4-to-1 or 3, somewhere in the 3 to 5 to 1 disadvantage in terms of troops, and they still managed to take over massive. They're still winning and taking over massive portions of a country that's like the size of Texas. It's a big country, and that had one of the most formidable militaries in all of Europe, and if not the most formidable in non-NATO countries, maybe outside of like North Korea, just because of pure numbers. But yeah, so it's going to get weird, and even though that we've seen this recent offensive from Ukraine and stuff. They're not in a good position there. And the difference is that even if they are able to match Russia in terms of spending and material because of NATO just literally pouring stuff into there, they can't match them in terms of troops. So that'll be the big step, is when are we going to see obviously they've had some sort of different types of mercenaries and stuff go in there, and foreign volunteers, but that's eventually going to run out. I think it's already running out. I think that's what this this offensive was this last push with the people that they have. So we can give them all the money, all the bullets, all the tanks we want, but if they run out of troops, eventually they're either going to have to give up or have actual NATO troops set foot on ground in Ukraine. And I'm not just talking about spec ops and CIA stuff, but like literally have divisions of NATO troops officially in Ukraine, and that's when things will get especially hairy if it happens. That is like obviously when World War III is officially on, even though it's already started now. So it's gonna get weird. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you later.